Tell me.
Pursuing aircraft that were
I got you, guy. Come here. Summertime.
Greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. All right, greetings everybody. Welcome to Conflict Radio. I guess we're still working on that new intro. Hopefully we get all of that stuff worked out here pretty soon. I see everybody in the chat room already. Paul Beska, Blue Chicken, the Happy Plague Doctor, Hugh Godarn is here. I've seen Mr. Fox, Antonio, how you doing? I don't know if let's see, Chuck Bam's here. Brandon, I see you're in the chat. Good to see.
Yes.
Yeah, good to see you in here. You did send me a link, and I posted it in the description, and I also added the YouTube link to your YouTube channel. I see. Let's see who else we got in here. Man, you guys have been in here chatting for a long time. All right, so I guess that's where we are. Barry was in here. I guess he's out fishing on the lake. So. Welcome to Conflict Radio, everybody. Do hit that like button. It'll help us out on the algorithm.
And I also added the YouTube link.
All right. So today we've got Brandon. How do you say your last name? We've always discussed this with my family and I. Whenever we see a Weichert realty sign, is it Weichert or Weichert or?
It's Weichert. It's Weichert. You're right. Yes.
All right, Weichert. So I'm right. Let's just say that right now, so everybody in my family knows that I've said it right this entire time. Right?
That's right. That's absolutely correct.
Brandon Weichert. Now, he is an M.A. in Statecraft and National Security Affairs from the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., and an associate member of New College at Oxford University. Geopolitical analyst Brandon Weichert travels the country briefing elements of the Department of Defense and various private groups on national security and emerging technology issues. Brandon, man, it's awesome to have you on the show. Welcome to Conflict Radio.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So I guess we're looking at this. I mean, let's just get right to it, right? This UFO report that's going to be, I guess it's supposed to drop tomorrow. Is that right? Is it coming tomorrow?
25th. Yeah.
So what do you think's going to be in it?
I think it's going to be very light on details. I think it's going to get a lot of people ginned up with a lot of sort of flashy headlines, but I don't think we're going to really have any real answers. I think that it was really a rushed sort of thing. They put it in the COVID relief bill, and they kind of made it sort of like a pork bill, where they just rolled a bunch of stuff unrelated to COVID into it. And one of the things they rolled in was the DoD, the Pentagon, Department of Defense, had 180 days to get to the bottom of the UAP UFO mystery, which of course has been with us for decades, and the whatever information is in official channels is spread across 17 different intelligence agencies and multiple offices within the opaque hundreds of billions of dollars a year Defense Department, where they're not all communicating with each other. Everything's been stovepiped. My understanding is it's probable that most of the investigators for this commission did not even have the proper clearances or maybe even the right training to investigate something like this. So basically, I think you're going to get a lot of interesting headlines with very little explanation or very little substance.
Wow. So who snuck this in the bill? Do we have any idea who was the person that snuck this in there?
Well, we know former Senator Harry Reid, Democrat Majority Leader, was actually the guy that initiated the ATIP program. That was the Pentagon's program to track officially these issues going back to 2008, and we know that Senator Reid initiated it. because his number one or one of his top donors out of Las Vegas, Richard Bigelow, was very interested in getting to the bottom of this phenomenon. Richard Bigelow runs Bigelow Aerospace. He has huge contracts both with NASA as well as the Pentagon. One of his big contracts is building inflatable habitats for the International Space Station. He's also been heavily invested in things like paranormal research at Skinwalker Ranch. He's obsessed with the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon program. He's funded scientific research, like legitimate research, into this phenomenon, which has really been considered sort of fringe until Bigelow got involved. So it was initiated many years ago by Harry Reid and carried over by interested parties both in the Senate and the House. I don't know the specifics of who put this in the bill, but it was very bipartisan. You know, it's people like Senator Marco Rubio are very interested in this from the national security aspect, and Democrats are also very interested in this. So it's one of the few things that got somewhat bipartisan support in this very tough political period. Unfortunately, though, I'm very skeptical that whatever's coming out tomorrow will really be the kind of the definitive answer on what exactly this phenomenon is. I'm happy to be proven wrong, though, but I know how government works. I've worked in government. 180 days to get to the bottom of something this big with the number of people they have involved, I really don't think it's going to be very conclusive.
Yeah, you know, I agree with you. I don't think they're going to tell us much of anything, honestly. I really don't. I think we're going to see a lot of redacted stuff. You think they're going to redact a lot of stuff out of it?
I wouldn't be surprised. I know that the movement or the legislation calls for disclosure, but the executive, that's coming from the legislative branch, which is Congress, but the executive branch, which is the president and the Pentagon and all the intel agencies, while Congress does have the power of the purse over these agencies, the executive branch has the ability to classify and, as you say, redact things even when Congress orders things to be revealed. So I would not be surprised if what's revealed tomorrow isn't that revelatory. It doesn't go beyond much of what we've seen in the news these last few years. And already you're seeing people like Christopher Mellon, the former national security, who's the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, if I remember correctly, during both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. He's been one of the most vocal proponents of getting this out to the people. And Lou Elizondo, former DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency head of the ATIP program that Harry Reid started, he's been in the press very recently kind of decrying this commission, saying that it's basically not going to be too shocking. They're not going to really get to the bottom of anything. So I think those two guys being the biggest, most prominent proponents from the government side of getting the truth out there, I think if they're giving everybody kind of a heads up that don't expect too much, I don't think anybody should be expecting too much from this thing tomorrow.
All right. So do you think, now just throwing this out there, you know, there's always a possibility that the government is putting forth their own people to try to make something out of, you know, make their own story, say, out of a story. Is it possible that, Luis, and this whole Academy of the Stars thing is all a propaganda arm of the government, and they're trying to take control of the narrative from the normal UFO podcasters?
No, I think my read on it is these are interested people. I mean, I think it's, the Blink-182 guitarist or one of the big rock stars from the 2000s is one of the guys bankrolling the To the Stars Academy. I think Bigelow is involved on some level with it. I don't think this is narrative hijacking. I think this is a group of former national security people who have a lot of credentials and have a lot to lose by doing this. I think this is them, after spending years looking at this from a national security aspect, saying, hey, we've got some extraordinary events happening in restricted airspace wherein our most advanced military technology and best trained people are saying they're seeing things that are defying their ability to defend the airspace, and the government doesn't seem to officially want to address this, so we as former government people have aligned with pocketed interest in the private sector to try to get the truth out there. Now, where I personally disagree or am a little skeptical is the conclusion, because I think Chris Mellon in particular is leaning in the direction that this is extraterrestrial. I don't see evidence for that yet. I'm open to that possibility. I was on George Norrie's show not long ago in which I said, I'm not going to discount it, but I'm very much of the Sherlock Holmes mentality, which says, once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is the truth. We haven't quite eliminated terrestrial explanations. And so what I mean by that is, we know the UFO patents, the so-called UFO patents, have been leaked to the press for years, in which the Patent and Trademark Office has Navy patents on file from a guy named Dr. Salvatore Pais, P-A-I-S, who worked with NAVAIR to develop exotic technologies that exhibited the features that a lot of these pilots are saying they're seeing, these physics-defying technologies, things like inertial mass reduction engine technology, EM shields, gravity beams. These are patents. You can Google them right now. If you Google them, UFO patents, you will see them come up. You'll probably see even an article I did for the Washington Times recently kind of delving into this. And so we haven't quite gotten an answer from the government as to the possibility that these are actually Navy systems that are being tested in restricted airspace, that they're so secretive that they're not communicating that with our F-15 pilots and our Marine Corps pilots and our sailors who are operating in those areas as well. We also haven't discounted the possibility, and I know some people are kind of skeptical of this, that it could be Chinese exotic technology or Russian exotic technology. Well, I hate to tell this to the skeptics, but China in particular has, in the last 15 years, really galvanized their high-tech R&D sector, and they now, for instance, have the world's largest wind tunnel, the JF-21 wind tunnel in Beijing, which can test, that has the longest test time for testing large hypersonic vehicles. We have the Lens 2 facility, the Navy does, but it can only last for about 80 milliseconds, whereas the Chinese version can last for 130 milliseconds. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot to you or I, but most engineers will tell you that that is significant. And when you look at the footage and you listen to the pilots that have encountered these UAPs, they're exhibiting a lot of the capabilities that we expect very advanced hypersonic technologies would be exhibiting. Lou Elizondo himself has not in the press discounted the possibility that these are actually, radical, exotic Chinese or Russian technologies that they're testing on us. In fact, just yesterday we had an instance where the British sailed one of their cruisers into the Black Sea near Crimea, which of course was occupied in 2014 by Russia, and the Russians apparently dropped a bomb right near, dangerously near the British warship. So clearly our rivals are getting more daring, and we know that Russia also has a high technology base, not as sophisticated as our own, but we haven't yet discounted the terrestrial possibilities, that it could hopefully be one of ours, or more dangerously, it could be Chinese or Russian tech.
Okay, so you actually travel around and you you literally brief the Department of Defense on certain things. Like that's just incredible, and thank you so much for coming on to our show.
Happy to, yes.
Have you ever thought of you guys, you all must have actually be thinking that there could be an advanced not extraterrestrial, but an advanced race of humans already on Earth with this technology that has nothing to do with China or Russia or the United States. Maybe they're, under the Antarctic ice or something, right? Like,
I don't know anything. I'm a subject matter expert, so I'm an outside advisor. They bring in occasionally. I've never heard that. We do have. Obviously, there's a race right now between us and the Russians for dominance in the Arctic, for the natural resources there. There is some concern, in fact, there could be soon, as the ice is melting and the climate is changing, there is concern that we could be soon competing for dominance in the Antarctic as well. I'm not familiar with some of what you're talking about. I do think, though, you're right to point out the possibility of human technology, but I would say what we really should be concerned about in terms of a threat would be if the human technology, the advanced technology we're seeing, was in fact Chinese or Russian. Again, the hope would be that if it's human, it would be ours, and it's just a simple case of one government bureaucracy not communicating it with the rest. I don't know. But I'm not familiar with the Antarctic theory.
Basically anywhere, I guess there's a lot of theories that human civilization has been around a lot longer than the Smithsonian tends to admit, right?
I'm sure that is a theory. I don't know. That's not really my bailiwick. I'd stick to the emerging technology and radical exotic technology that's being developed by, humans. Like I said, it's certainly a possibility that there are other things going on that we don't know about. But I don't know beyond that about what you're talking about.
So it's also possible that the U.S. government knows that it's Russian or China, and they're keeping it secret, to basically keep secret from the American people just how dated our military really is, right?
That's correct. That is something that is certainly a very probable explanation if it is in fact terrestrial. We could be seeing that our government just doesn't want to admit that we don't have control over the skies. Remember, these events are happening not just at bases far removed from the United States. These are happening in the continental United States. So we like to fancy ourselves as the sole superpower. But as I noted, China in particular, but Russia also, are developing a bevy of radical exotic technologies to sort of leapfrog us and give their forces an edge in the near term, possibly, over our own. So it could be that our government is thinking that this is either Chinese or Russian, but they don't want to admit it. I think it's very interesting. The government, and I noted this in my Washington Times piece, the government came out and said it's not our technology, and they also came out and said it's likely not ET, but they won't discount the fact that it's Chinese or Russian. And so I think that maybe there is somewhat of a debate going on behind the scenes of maybe we should let people know that we don't have control over our skies and that China's testing or Russia's testing some exotic technology on us. That's frightening. But I could understand why there would be a fight within government to admit this. Certainly that's something, like I said, that I've seen Lou Elizondo, that's something that he has certainly posited as a possibility. It's something that we would absolutely need to get to the bottom of, which is why I think actually what Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo are doing, I think it's important. I think it's sad they had to go outside of government to do it. Because after 9/11, you would think that we would, as a government, not want to be surprised again with an enemy, getting the best of us. But sadly, it seems that the government doesn't want to address this issue. But the tempo and the severity of the encounters that our forces are having with these unidentified aerial phenomenon are increasing over the last 12 years. So we can't ignore it. And I think that's what Elizondo has been trying to say, is you can't ignore it, whatever it is. And certainly for me, with my background and what I do, I'm always on the lookout for what China or Russia are doing. If you look at Chinese investments, so for instance, biotech is another beat that I cover. If you look at what China has been doing with biotechnology over the last 15 years, what they've been doing with CRISPR, which is the gene editing program, they've been trying to gene splice or gene dope soldiers to create, quite frankly, superhumans, which of course sounds insane to most people, but when you look at what China's been doing, that is precisely what they have been investing their research and development dollars into. When you look at, for instance, the Wuhan lab theory, it's not just a conspiracy theory. We now finally have senior intelligence people coming forward and saying this is a high degree of probability that the COVID-19 was a gain-of-function test that got out of hand at the Wuhan lab. And when you look at what Beijing has been so interested in doing, they are looking at high tech and throwing a lot of their money at building out infrastructure to support radical, exotic, high-tech R&D as a means of leapfrogging the Americans strategically. Bioweapons research. We see, for instance, the Uyghurs are being corralled into these concentration camps, and one of the first things that's done to them is their DNA is taken, and it's put into a giant database. And what the Chinese military has talked about is using their advanced artificial intelligence, which they have been pioneering, to conduct genetic research to pinpoint genetic abnormalities located within subgroups of people, like the Uyghurs, and to use that to create biological weapons to conduct, quote, specific genetic attacks. They're compiling these DNA sequences into a giant database to create specific genetic weapons to wipe out undesirable groups of people. This is Nazi-level stuff. And this science fiction sounding to you or to most people, but this is what China's doing, and it's very serious. We talk about quantum computing. It sounds like a science fiction thing. Well, China right now, because of their investment, China right now has the only working quantum internet. They deployed the satellite in 2016, and they have help, by the way, from Germany and France and many American allies. Well, China realizes that quantum internet right now is very rudimentary, but if you build it, they will come, and the first mover advantage will go to them, they think, and that they could basically get in at the ground level of the next telecommunications revolution, a revolution that could displace the American-dominated internet. And they could end up reaping the benefits, not just economically, but geopolitically, geostrategically as well. Remember, we invested in the United States in the 40s and 50s in the first telecommunications revolution. We laid the groundwork. We invested the infrastructure. And therefore, all the innovations, the benefits redounded to the United States economically and militarily. That's how we're able to do. The NSA is able to have all of its eavesdropping because of the fact that we literally built the infrastructure for the World Wide Web, and now China's trying to do the same thing with next generation quantum internet. And they want to have those capabilities, and they want to deny us or deprive us of that capability. And so science fiction of even 5 years ago is becoming science fact. And so when we look at UAPs, I look at it and tell my colleagues, don't poo-poo it. Don't think that, well, the Chinese they're imitators, not innovators. They very much are innovators. They imitated us as long as they had to get an industrial base indigenous to China. Now they're leapfrogging, and now they're innovating. And the works of Odin Shankar prove, he has a book came out in 2010 called Copycats, and he looked at firms, private companies that are innovative, and the majority that are imitative. And he did a study, and he said, well, are the innovators the ones who always reap the most benefit? And he found that actually a majority of the time, it's the imitative companies, the ones that copycat the innovators. They end up overwhelming and beating the innovative firms because they're able to avoid the pitfalls of being first. So China has, in fact, copied us for long enough where they now have a lot of our capabilities over there, and now they're attracting Western capital and Western talent over to them, where innovations are now being done over to them. So it is not an impossibility that these UAPs, UFOs, whatever you want to call them, that the Navy and the Marines are seeing, it's not an impossibility that these are actually Chinese hypersonic vehicles on display, or even Russian hypersonic. I mean, Russia has proven over the last 5 years that there is real innovation going on within Russia at the hypersonic technological level.
All right, so I guess what you're saying is that we're kind of ignorant to vulnerability.
Yes, we are. I mean, remember, we ignored the fact that the fact that Japan was using aircraft carriers at the beginning in the interwar years. They were using aircraft carriers innovatively. We thought the battleship in the 1930s was the penultimate weapon, naval warfare weapon to have, and we ignored the aircraft carrier, looked at it as kind of this ancillary sideshow, waste of money, boondoggle. And it turned out the battleships were useless, and the Japanese showed us in Pearl Harbor just how serious of a threat aircraft carriers were. And so there's historical evidence in many people's lifetimes, in fact, that an enemy can actually fixate on a particular set of technologies, leapfrog the Americans, leapfrog the West, and use them in a bolt from the blue attack to knock us on our butts. And it takes us a long time to kind of recalibrate and hit back. And my concern is that today, with the way modern technology is, that I'm so sorry, our dogs.
That's
our
all
dogs
right.
That the way that modern technology is, that if the Chinese or Russians are able to get a leg up on us and use a technology decisively against us, we might not be able to recover the way we did after Pearl Harbor. Remember, the reason we were able to recover the way we did after Pearl Harbor was because we had a latent industrial capacity. Well, what have we done for the last 50, 40 years? We've given away our industrial capabilities to China, and now they have those mass production capabilities, and we don't. The Navy's having trouble building out enough submarines to even meet current requirements, let alone being able to mass produce enough submarines to potentially fight China in a war. And remember, the submarine, not the aircraft carrier, in this next round of great power conflict, the submarine will be the tip of the spear, and we don't have enough subs to be of really any use. And so these are the things I'm looking at going, if, God forbid, we did get into a war, there's a possibility that either China or Russia has developed a couple of different radical technologies that might be able to beat us in an open engagement, and that's scary.
All right. Well, let me just take a second here and thank Dr. Strangelove and TK422 for the super chats. I really do appreciate it. There's also one from Blue Chicken. Thank you guys. All your contributions is what keeps this show going, and we definitely appreciate it. So let me ask you this: you talk about a Pearl Harbor type attack on our country. And to be quite honest with you, we might have already had that with COVID, right? I mean, that very well could have been an attack. I mean, if you think about it, our economy was soaring. China was in deep trouble. I mean, it was just, it was like life was great here, and all of a sudden COVID happened. So you have to think about that. What's that sound that's going on there?
I'm sorry, you're talking about regarding COVID being a biological Pearl Harbor?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was interesting. I was talking to a group of senior Air Force people February of 2020, right before the national lockdowns went into effect, and this came up. And I told them my opinion that I was convinced. You see, my wife is a geneticist, worked at NIH, I had familiar with gain of function and sort of that stuff through her. And I just mentioned in passing the possibility that this was a gain of function test, and it may have actually been funded by NIH. Because they're
Fauci funded it.
I'm sorry?
Fauci funded it.
Yes. And the military didn't like what I said. I ended up getting a letter from one of the colonels basically telling me I would not be allowed to brief at that facility anymore, because at the time I found out later the word was, official word in the military and intelligence circles was, we're not going to talk about that as a possibility. It's not something we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And remember, the scientific community was poo-pooing this thing from the beginning, and it's only just now in the last 6 weeks coming out, what I knew from the beginning, it's only just now coming out that, in fact, many of these scientists who were saying that it's a conspiracy theory, it's not true, they actually had financial interests with the Wuhan lab, so they had to come out and say it wasn't true because they didn't want their funding to dry up.
Yeah.
And so, and when I was interestingly, I was in Washington, D.C. in the fall of last year, around Thanksgiving, and one of the Marine Corps intel guys, he used the phrase biological Pearl Harbor, and he told me after one of my talks, he said, "Oh, we're convinced that this was a leak from a lab, that this was a man-made incident, and we're just, we don't know if it was purposeful or accidental." And that, my response to him was, hey, look, whether it was purposeful or an accident, we know one thing: the Chinese government weaponized the response. They prevented the rest of the world from knowing there was a pandemic in China for as long as possible.
Well, not only that, Brandon, but they wouldn't let flights from Wuhan go anywhere in China, but they let flights from Wuhan go all over the world.
That's right, exactly. And 72,000, I think, from November 2019 to the end of January, beginning of February 2020, 72,000 people from Wuhan flew to the west coast of the United States in that 3-month period. I think you had something like 5 million people over that 3-month period leaving Wuhan, flying all around the world, but none of them were allowed to go up the road to a nearby city in China, but they were all encouraged and allowed to go all around the world to spread this thing. So what I was telling the Marine Corps intelligence guy was, it doesn't really matter at this point. I mean, it does, but really it's the issue is, whether it was an accidental or purposeful leak, or even if it did come from the wet market, it doesn't matter. The fact is, the regime weaponized the response. And my theory, and this is my next article I'm working on, and I'll give you a little preview, my theory is that it actually was probably very intentional. And the reason is, the Trump administration, whether you like him or not, the former president, I think, had a better understanding of the China threat than any president of the last 30 years.
Well, I think the other ones are paid to ignore it.
Yes, that could be it. That could be it. And what I'll say about that is Trump came in as Mr. Dealmaker, and he was right to say China is eating, if you pardon the expression, is eating our lunch on agricultural products. So I'm going to raise tariffs on foodstuffs coming out of the United States going into China. Well, in Beijing, they had a very different view of what that was. To Trump and the Americans, this was a simple trade. It was simple trade negotiation. We were going to play hardball, force the Chinese to come to the table. They'd give a little bit, and ultimately we'd make a better deal that would be more beneficial to us after 30 years of China basically having their way with us on agricultural products. China didn't look at it that way. Beijing's leaders are deeply aware of 5,000 years of Chinese history. And the one thing they know is that in all 5,000 years of Chinese history, whether you're talking about the imperial dynasties, whether you're talking about the nationalists, whether you're talking about the Communist Party, it doesn't matter. The 5,000 years of Chinese history all point to one thing. There is a threat to a regime in China when there is hunger, when there is food scarcity. China has a lot of capabilities, but the one thing historically they've never really had is the ability to consistently, reliably feed their people. And what China looked at that as, they didn't look at that and say, oh, this is just a simple business deal, simple trade. They said, my goodness, the Americans are waging war on us through other means. So we are going to hit back at Trump because he's the only American to really threaten us in any serious way. And what they did was, I think once this thing leaked out from the lab, once this thing got out from Wuhan, I think China's regime said, this is how we're going to get back at the Americans. We'll sign that trade agreement with them, but we're going to stick it to them in the fine print. We're going to let this disease get out and get around the world, and we know the Americans will not be able to handle it, and it's going to kill their economy and maybe even get Trump out of office and put someone more pliable in office like Joe Biden, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and it's funny how, as this, I guess, made-for-TV virus was breaking out, that Nancy Pelosi held on to those articles of impeachment until the day the very first case was reported in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting how that worked out. I don't know if there was planning there, but I definitely know that the Democrats. Let me put it this way: I have most of my friends are in the Democratic Party. I am not, but most of my friends are. And I worked on Capitol Hill. I worked on political campaigns since the age of 16. And on and off. And I have a lot of friends who worked for the Biden as well as the Bernie campaigns. Every one of them in December of 2019, in January of 2019, not one of them believed their candidate could win against Trump because things were so good in the economy, generally speaking, they didn't think they could beat him.
Yeah.
And then COVID happened.
Well, I still don't think they beat him, but we should probably move on from this. Look,
Sure.
I've got a super chat from the Happy Plague Doctor. He wants me to ask you about the X-37B shuttle drones and the stealth submarines. So could you tell us about those?
Yeah, so the X-37B is a really cool piece of technology. After the space shuttle was idiotically decommissioned by the Obama administration, I was no fan of the space shuttle, by the way, but it was at least keeping us in the game of manned space flight. And after that was decommissioned, because remember, we used the space shuttle not just for civilian purposes, we used it also for military missions to launch and repair sensitive military satellites that were in orbit. The Air Force wanted to keep that capability, and they knew if the space shuttle was decommissioned with no replacement in sight, they would lose that capability. So they had a side project, the X-37B, which was basically a mini space shuttle, an unmanned, kind of like a space drone. And so they said, we're gonna invest in this to keep that capability alive for us. And they did. And so the X-37B is basically an unmanned mini shuttle. They use that to do a series of classified, semi-classified missions. One of them, for instance, is to surveil, the satellite constellations of rival states like China and Russia. For instance, the X-37B, if I'm not mistaken, holds the longest record for continuous orbit of an unmanned vehicle in space. They used it to test experimental engines. Things like the electromagnetic drive were tested in the last few years, or at least part of it, I believe, was tested aboard one of the X-37Bs. It's a very classified, opaque system, so we don't know a lot about it, but we know enough to know that it's keeping the military in sort of this satellite warfare game. And it's also allowing the military to test its own radical engine systems for space. And so it's a really cool thing, and my hope was that Space Force was going to sort of build out its own suite of these capabilities, and they haven't. In fact, my interactions with Space Force, with all due respect to them, have been somewhat depressing. they seem to only want to deal with satellite defense, which is important. But that isn't the end-all, be-all. We have to be thinking long-term the way the Chinese and Russians do about space. Space is another war-fighting domain, like the sea, like land, like air, like cyberspace. And we need to be thinking from a doctrinal, strategic level, not just about protecting our satellites and making them more survivable, but also space warfare, not just using space as a platform to help the other domains in war, but as a warfare domain itself. And so satellite warfare and things like military space stations and things like using the X-37B possibly. Now, they're not going to, because I don't think it actually is built for this, but the next generation could be, using them for orbital bombardment and possibly eventually 20 years down the line, maybe, to redeploy forces from orbit to hot zones rapidly, or to redeploy much-needed supplies into contested landing zones. These are things that I wanted Space Force to be looking at, but over the last few years, Space Force has really expressed disinterest in this. The Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, which is one of the coolest groups of the Pentagon, they have put a call out in the last 2 years for proposals for human-rated military space stations. But that project is sadly in development hell, as they say in Hollywood, and I don't suspect it will be going anywhere, particularly now that the military is poo-pooing the idea of dropping troops from space and using space as sort of redeployment for supplies. I think that's a mistake. But the X-37B was part of the initial movement to create capabilities of the sort that I'm talking about. The unmanned submarines, these are things that the Navy's developing. I think they're really cool, and I wish that they would build more out. But the X-37B is what I'm really familiar with. I've only consulted with the Navy 3 times now in the last 4 years, all of which have been really edifying, but I'm not as familiar with what the Navy's unmanned programs are as I am with the Air Force. But the Navy's unmanned programs are also very interesting. One of the concepts I'm a big fan of, and this is what I spoke with one of the naval units about in November, was basically modifying the submarine fleet to be able to not just launch missiles, but to launch drones as sort of like an underwater aircraft carrier. And it's something that they're heavily interested in. This was a concept initially floated in 1945 by the Japanese. They attempted to build an aircraft carrier that could launch 2 prop planes with seaplanes that would then not return to the submarine but would land. And I believe there was a working prototype. When we defeated Japan, we discovered the partially built prototype. But this is sort of an evolution of that idea. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to deploy manned aircraft from a sub, but we could certainly, from the launch tubes, launch unmanned vehicles. And if the Chinese were to try to invade Taiwan, and they would probably be effective in creating an anti-access area denial air defense bubble that would make it very difficult for our aircraft carriers to get in close and launch air assets. We could certainly use submarines, conceivably, to launch unmanned aerial vehicles to conduct the kinds of attacks that aircraft carrier air wings would conduct.
Do you think Biden would do anything if China attacked Taiwan?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Interestingly, me not being a Biden person, I have had more in the last 2 months, 3 months, interactions with the Biden team than I did with the Trump team, which is interesting. There's an interesting fight. My understanding is, and I know Josh Rogan a bit, and Josh reported on this frequently for the Washington Post, and Josh has talked to me about this. And I've seen this in my interactions with them. There seems to be this fight breaking out behind the scenes in the Biden administration. Biden is, as an executive, he's very weak. He is not the decider, as George W. Bush liked to say of himself. Joe Biden has 3 or 4 different factions really driving policy, and they're not all on the same page. So when it comes to China, you've got the hawks. People like Kurt Campbell, people like Tony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, people like Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor. Then you have other groups like the Doves, who are represented mostly by people like John Kerry or Susan Rice, who, although they technically don't have a direct foreign policy portfolio, in some respects they're more powerful than those who have direct foreign policy portfolios, because they were instrumental in picking a lot of the people to work in the Biden administration, and they have sort of this floating presence. They can kind of drop in, kind of like Dick Cheney used to do during the Bush administration. And then there's another group I call, the political hacks. These are the people around Biden. They don't really care about policy. They just want to keep Biden's numbers above 60%. And then you have a fourth group, the Kamala Harris wing, and they have their own agenda. And so those 3 or 4 groups are all competing for dominance in China policy. Right now, the hawks, because it makes Biden look good when he comes out against China in the press, the hawks have a lot of leverage. But the question is, at the end of the day, if something really big were to happen, like a Chinese attack on Taiwan, would the hawks have enough sway or pull to execute military strategy? I don't know. And I think that ambiguity is not a source of strength. It's actually encouraging the Chinese to get more aggressive and to get more dangerous when it comes to Taiwan, to the point that I have told Taiwanese officials off the record this when I've met with them. I would not count on the United States being able to rush in to save the day if China were to invade. And I think Beijing is certainly banking on the fact that the Biden administration seems, while rhetorically they're tougher, behind the scenes, the Biden administration seems to really want to cool down the rhetoric. Let me give you one more example. My colleague David Goldman over at the Asia Times, he has been ahead of the curve on this reporting, but there is right now a secret deal being hatched between the Chinese central bank and the Federal Reserve of the United States, wherein China has agreed tentatively to buy up more of our debt in exchange for the Biden administration reducing or all out removing the Trump administration's sanctions on 49 Chinese tech firms such as TikTok, as well as to get the United States to buy 40% more Chinese-built goods. This would be to help mitigate the inflation that all the excess spending over the last year has created. And the Biden administration is going to do this. They're already in talks to do this. And so, rhetorically, the hawks in the Biden administration appear to be carrying the day, but on substantive issues, like possibly defending Taiwan militarily, or this issue of the inflation and having China buy up more of our debt, it seems like the Biden administration is listening to the Doves. And so that's a scary thing. So I don't know if we would be able to defend Taiwan.
All right, so the Happy Plague Doctor, thank you so much for your super chats today. Brandon, do you think we stopped flying space planes in the 60s with the X-15?
I think that the X-37B and an assortment of other technologies indicate that we were at least somewhat maintaining experiments with that. I don't know if we were as invested as we were back then, but I do think that the Air Force at sort of the covert level, and this is just me looking at data in the open source realm, I do think the Air Force maintains some of those capabilities. They just don't talk about it. I think there's a lot of technology that the Navy in particular, but also the Air Force has been developing and investing in over the last 40 years that if it ever was exposed to the public would appear to be rather exotic. And so I don't think they ever stopped developing space planes. And I think, like I said, the X-37 is somewhat of a proof that at the least unmanned level, at a very small level, they maintained an investment in those capabilities.
All right, so let me ask you about the rods of God.
Yeah.
Is that a real thing?
Well, they're tungsten rods. They can be launched from space. The Earth's gravity would basically give it extra inertia, and it would impact the surface of the Earth with the force of a nuclear blast without any of the radioactive fallout. Are they real? Well, we know the Air Force wants them and has wanted them for a few decades now. I don't know if we've ever deployed the systems. I don't think we have. I think it's a mistake that we haven't. But I know that it's something that the Air Force has been on their wish list for several years. The problem is congressional support. There's also that tricky outer space treaty, which says you can't weaponize space. But the Chinese and Russians have already proven a workaround. The Chinese and Russians for the last several years have been deploying co-orbital satellites. These are small satellites with grappling arms. The Russians call them Istrebitel Sputnikov. The Chinese have developed similar capabilities, and they can be used to tailgate our sensitive satellites in orbit. Now, in peacetime, the Russians and Chinese say these are just repair drones for their satellites. If one of their communications or weather or surveillance satellites go down, the Russians and Chinese say these co-orbital satellites are used for remote repair. But in wartime, those systems, they're dual use. In wartime, those systems can be deployed offensively to physically, with their grappling arms, push our sensitive satellites out of orbit, rendering American forces on land, at sea, in the air, in cyberspace, deaf, dumb, and blind, giving Chinese and or Russian forces a strategic advantage over the American forces.
Don't they have some satellite that also shoots out a net of some kind?
Yes, this was a Russian system that they tested last year that wigged everybody out. Again, the Russians say, well, the Russians, first of all, they don't acknowledge it. Second of all, when you do corner Russian officials, they go, oh, that's just used to collect space junk, or oh, that's just used to repair satellites, to repair satellites or to capture damaged satellites. Well, it's not. These are offensive systems that the Russians and Chinese have used. They're part of the gray zone operations, the space between war and peace, the asymmetrical capabilities that Russia and China have become so good at. These are offensive systems that are barely disguised as peacetime systems. And the Russians testing that system the way they did against a UK satellite constellation proves that these are offensive systems. And God help us if we ever get into a war, because we're really not yet at the stage where we can conceptualize what we would do or how we would react or how we keep our satellites survivable. And that's something that we've been really bad at. And it's a strategic gap for sure.
All right. So the rods of God, is that the same as the Star Wars program that Reagan was trying to launch?
It's a little bit different. Basically,
it's like the upgraded Star Wars, right?
It's sort of an offshoot. The Strategic Defense Initiative was trying to use either ballistic missiles or lasers or some combination of both in orbit to track and destroy incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, at the time fired from the Soviet Union, to basically create a shield around the United States and possibly its allies. Rods from God was conceived, and this is why they never did it, at least to my knowledge, was conceived as explicitly an offensive capability. Basically, we would put satellites or launch vehicles in orbit with these tungsten rods that could be sent over any target within a very short amount of time, deployed into orbit, brought down by gravity, and detonate, basically, not detonate, but basically smash into a target on the ground and have the same effect as a nuclear weapon without the radioactive fallout. So rods from God, a little bit different from SDI. It's similar but different. SDI was primarily a defensive system, whereas rods from God is inherently an offensive system.
All right. So, you mentioned lasers, and I got to talk about this because I live near Redstone Arsenal here in Huntsville, Alabama. And I've actually talked to people that have been, on the base. They come down for this. There's a big conference here once a year.
Yeah.
They do the big armed conference here.
Yeah.
And this guy was telling me that they're actually melting tanks on the base with lasers, and that the problem that they're having is that once they shoot the laser and melt the tank, the laser destroys itself. Do you know anything about this weapon and
Well, the military has. So let me tell you about lasers. The U.S. military has been heavily interested and invested in lasers going back to the 80s. So it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know specifically, but it wouldn't surprise me at all that the Air Force in particular has this system, some working form, given how much money and time was dedicated to the building out of this system. On the other hand, you know who's pioneered the use of lasers as a form of anti-satellite weaponry? And that would be the Chinese. So the Chinese a few years ago successfully tested from the Xichang Satellite Launch Center. They successfully field tested a laser that can blind the optical gear of American satellites passing overhead. Basically, using a laser you hit a laser at the receiving end of an American satellite, a surveillance satellite. It overloads the optical gear, and it fries the system. Even temporarily, it gives China a window of opportunity. What our satellites do is they shut down when they're subjected to that kind of an attack. And they basically turn away from the Earth and open their solar panels to recharge and reset the system. Hopefully a ground operator can repair the system, sort of like running home to mama. In the meantime, that system in orbit is a wasting asset, and we don't have spares on hand that can be readily deployed. So we basically have then a gap in that satellite constellation, and it's a hit or miss as to whether we can offload the functions onto a similar nearby system. So there's a gap now the Chinese can then exploit. So the Chinese have also been heavily invested in using lasers for a very specific purpose, which is anti-satellite warfare, counter-space warfare. So your point about our military having lasers that can possibly melt infantry or armor, it is certainly a possibility. It would not surprise me in the least, given how much time and money we've spent building out those systems. But we've had a lot of difficulty with that, and I think also maybe we've been too ambitious. The Chinese have been very specific in what they want to use lasers for, and it's actually an attainable goal with present technological capabilities. Using lasers to melt armor, possible, yes. More possible probably than what most public intellectuals would acknowledge. I don't know, though, if it's something we've tested or have.
Okay. Yeah, because the guy was telling me that if we can get it to where we can actually melt the tank and not destroy itself, they're going to immediately put it on satellites. And I was curious because we've seen...
Well, with that, you'd have to also, not just that, you'd have to make it scalable. You have to make it small enough where it's not so expensive. Because remember, when we're putting things into orbit, you have delta V. You've got fuel constraints. So when you're talking about that, you can't have a system that's too big because then it's too expensive to launch. So any laser that we would conceivably have right now that could do that would probably be very large. And so we couldn't put it into space yet until we can figure out how to have a system that powerful, smaller. And so I don't know yet. I mean, maybe we're at the stage where we can melt things, but I don't think we're yet at the stage where it can be kind of miniaturized and put into orbit. We'll get there, hopefully. but
Yeah.
not yet.
Don M says the DO laser system has melted armor. Just Google it. And I'm not talking about just melted armor. I'm talking about they're melting entire tanks. So just look at a tank and then just picture it a pool of liquid. That's what they're.
I don't know. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of that claim. The military has been investing in lasers for a long time, and the results have been mixed. Again, not impossible. And you throw enough money at a problem like this. China proves this all the time. You throw enough money and you throw enough human capital at a problem, technological problem, you'll probably find a workaround eventually. So maybe we're there. I haven't seen anything. Again, I'm not an engineer, and the military usually brings me in to talk about venture capital investments in high tech to sort of track what China's doing, what Russia's doing. They bring me in to talk about sort of the geopolitical implications of exotic or emerging technology, specifically in Eurasia. So it wouldn't surprise me if the military has developed this capability, but I'm a little skeptical given what I know from working on the Hill and from how we've tried in the past to invest, like the airborne laser system, for instance. It was a real big boondoggle. It was a great idea, but we never could make it work the way that we needed it to.
All right. So, let me ask you this. We've all seen these forest fires that have happened last summer out in California and Oregon and Washington State. I've also seen a lot of pictures thrown up on my news feed, whatever, of what looks like a laser coming down, starting these fires, and a lot of it posted in the context that these are Chinese satellites basically shooting lasers down, starting all these fires across the Midwest. Do you think that that's possible, and if that's happening?
No, I don't think that's happening. China, what they've been doing with lasers is very specific. So, for instance, as I said, it's all anti-satellite. The problem right now with lasers is the scalability. You need a lot of energy consistently to be able to do the kinds of attacks you're talking about. And right now, no one has quite yet figured out how to make a laser that's powerful enough to do what you're saying and to make it small enough where it can go into space. And so I don't think that's anything. I think that might be a bit of fake news, as the former president would say. I don't know. I'm skeptical of that claim. The west coast of the United States it's a dry place, and forest fires happen, and you also have to worry about arsonists. I'd be more concerned about a fire jihad from an Islamist or even a domestic terrorist starting it rather than a laser from China.
Yeah, all right. So let me welcome Spartan O Negative. He is a conflictor recruit now. Thanks so much, Spartan, for joining our membership program. Brandon, I have to ask you, who is Corn Pop?
If you remember, Joe Biden during the campaign was at a pool, and it was the pool that he originally, as a teenager, lifeguarded at, and it was an African-American pool back in the day, and of course you remember it was segregation, and he told a very interesting story to the press that became a bit of a meme about how he took on a gangster named Corn Pop with a switchblade. And he said Corn Pop was a bad dude. And there were some wonderful, I think Schmo Yoho on YouTube has a hilarious video about Corn Pop being a bad dude.
Yeah,
and,
Corn Pop being a bad dude comes up in our chat every show. It seems like that's going to be a question for every guest now. Who is Corn Pop? And let's see if we can get an answer to it.
The Joe Bidenism at its finest.
Yeah. All right. So there was a question here somebody had asked, and bummer. I scrolled past it. I guess I don't see it here, but it was a good. Oh, I think it was Blue Chicken telling me about directed energy. That's what I meant to tell you. The directed energy weapons, right?
Yeah. Well, this is something, again, the Air Force has been really hot and heavy into. They haven't been able to make it work yet, but they're invested in it. And, basically it's like phasers from Star Trek or, like blasters from Star Wars. It's really cool if they can make it work. But as of yet, my understanding is it's very rudimentary. They've not been able to do it. And again, you have the issue of scalability. You can you can do anything if you have a lot of power and something's big enough. But you've got to make that thing small enough to be useful to the average warfighter. And right now, whatever they've been working on is still very rudimentary. But again, they're invested in it. I don't think they're invested enough in it. And we know, again, that China's investing in it. The Russians are invested in it as well. So we really have to, I think, one of the problems we have today is the federal research and development budget for high tech. So back in the 40s, the federal government said, we think there's a strategic application. We don't know what it is, but we think there's a strategic application to telecommunications, to the computer, to all of the sort of the things that ended up making Silicon Valley what it was. So what they did was they said, we're going to take a potload of taxpayer dollars, throw it into building out the infrastructure needed to conduct the kind of high-tech R&D that's needed. Think of Bell Labs back in the day. And we're going to basically lower the risk for private venture capital to come in after we've built that infrastructure for high-tech R&D and let private venture capital come in and basically spin off and innovate with the private sector from there. And that is how you had the Silicon Valley revolution of the last century. That is how you had Mariana Mazzucato. I think she's a brilliant lady. I don't agree with everything she believes in, but she's a brilliant lady, and she wrote The Entrepreneurial State, which was a 2013 book, and she wrote in that book, that was an example of when John Maynard Keynes shook hands with Adam Smith. It was when public sector brought all of its resources to bear in order to attract private innovation, and you had the revolution, the high-tech revolution of the last century. And from there, we have a lot of the technologies that we take for granted. Today, since 1994, the high-tech federal research and development budget has declined precipitously at precisely the moment that the corollary or the similar thing in China, their version of the federal high-tech R&D budget, has exploded. They have been investing in science, tech, engineering, and math for the last 30 years in really incredible ways, and they're now seeing the fruits of that investment bear out. Whereas we have separated public and private sector to such a point when it comes to high-tech research and development that the private sector is great for innovating the next cornflake or a new button on your iPhone. But for the really big-ticket stuff, they need the backing of the federal government to do that, and they can't because the federal government doesn't want to do that anymore. I would recommend your viewers look up, in the last 6 months, there was an interview that Eric Weinstein did with Lex Friedman, in which he talked about how he met Jeffrey Epstein one time he was looking for funding for his research into the geometric unity of everything, and he couldn't get federal funding for it because the National Science Foundation didn't have the resources, and what little resources they had, they didn't want to spend it on something so esoteric, but it was very important. He had to look, as he said, to scumbags like Jeffrey Epstein for funding, because that's how our system now has been built out, where it takes a few gonzo private entrepreneurs like a Jeffrey Epstein, like a Peter Thiel, Mark Zuckerberg was starting to get into this, but you don't have the backing of the society. that you used to have in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And you have now a decline in results, frankly. You hear people like Michio Kaku talking about the great stagnation. Peter Thiel talks about the great stagnation in high-tech research and development in the West. You don't have that happening in China. And so, when we talk about investments into directed energy weapons, the investment and interest is there, but the public sector can't do it on its own, and they can't innovate on their own, and they're not attracting the private capital the way that they used to, and the private investment and research they used to. So you have this great divorce between public resources and private innovation, and it's killing us, I think. It really is.
All right, so let me take this time. I guess we've got about 20 minutes left, so let me throw this out there to the listeners. If you guys have any questions for Brandon, go ahead and put it in caps, and I'll ask them. So my last one that I wrote down for you, Brandon, is about space mining and the right of private corporations to claim certain asteroids. Now, is it corporations or business? I mean, couldn't I, Conflict Radio, claim an asteroid for myself?
So how it works is, because basically when I was on the Hill, I was part of the group that got the Space Launch Competitiveness Act passed. And 2015, we all got together, and it was actually, in all fairness to the Democrats and Obama, they signed the law. They were on board with it as well. And the reason they were is because at the time there were companies coming online that were developing interest and capabilities and investments in space mining. And they weren't all American companies. There were a lot of Chinese state-owned entities that were starting to say, we want to build capabilities to capture asteroids, to capture the moon, mine it, and sell it back to the Earth, because there's a large rare earth mineral market in the solar system, on the moon, in the asteroid belt, in the outer planets. Or rather the moons around the outer planets. And it's a minimum of a $1 trillion industry. It's considerably more, though, when you consider that there is an asteroid near Earth. It's a giant asteroid. They nicknamed it, I think, the potato. It's full of rare earth minerals, and it's worth $700 quintillion. For a point of reference, the entire GDP of Earth's economy is $32 trillion. So we're talking magnitudes higher in terms of the worth of this one asteroid. China in November has launched the NEO-1 satellite, which is an observer satellite in geosynchronous orbit that can identify mineable asteroids, and they're now, I think in the next 6 months, going to be launching an actual mining robotics satellite as a proof of concept that will go to an asteroid and mine it. NASA did something similar with OSIRIS-REx. The Japanese did something similar as well. Japan is heavily invested in space mining specifically. And so basically what we did in 2015 was say, because all these countries have state capitalism to some degree, they have state-owned enterprises. These are companies that are technically private, but they have the full faith and backing of the public sector in their country. That's an unfair advantage. The Outer Space Treaty says technically we're not supposed to be allowed to go out and claim resources in space as your private. It's explicitly it explicitly says private companies can't, but these other countries are getting around it by having these state-owned enterprises. Well, we don't do that in the United States because we're capitalists. So what we're going to do is we're not going to say a company can go out and claim territory, because that would be illegal. But there was some wiggle room in the way the Outer Space Treaty was written. And so what we did was say, if a company can go out and land on a resource-rich area, and if they can extract resources, mineable resources, from that asteroid, well, then they can sell it back on Earth. And that was the workaround. So technically, these companies under American law would not be able to lay claim to territory, but they could mine those resources and make money off those resources. And hopefully, by the way, the American government would tax that sale so that we might be able to recoup some of our, that we could maybe invest in some of the social programs that are ailing here in the United States. And if it's over $1 trillion economy, I mean, think about all the taxable income we could have there, and that was sort of the workaround. Now, the big issue was with that law, there was a lot of pushback from certainly the international community, and there was also pushback from the State Department, which was saying that it was a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. At the time, much to his credit, Mr. Obama said, I'm going to sign the law anyway because it needs to be done. It's in our national interest. So there is some bipartisan support there, but there's certainly a lot of legal arguments going on right now. And you have people, very prominent space lawyers, which is a real profession. You have very prominent space lawyers like Thomas Gangal, who in the 70s was all for the privatization of space. He, in the last 30 or 40 years, has gone completely in the opposite direction, and he's now saying this can't be allowed. It's going to create a competition for space we don't want. And I disagree. I say, hey, look, competition is esprit de corps. It's how you have innovation, and through that innovation, all of society is benefiting. We need those resources for technology development. We need the money. Let's create new industries. This is the future. The Chinese see it that way, and they're certainly not going to be hemmed in by any Western interpretation of international law. Why should we be?
All right, so I could technically claim an asteroid or a comet or something for all for myself, right?
No, technically, my understanding and reading of it is you technically can't claim it as your own. What you can do is land there with equipment, mine the resources, and those resources you have mined are now your property, and you can bring them back home and sell them at market. All
right. So Paul Beska asks, are there any countries already mining in space?
Not yet, but as I said, the NASA OSIRIS-REx mission was a proof of concept. Now, that was scientific in nature, but the private sector, particularly Elon Musk, was watching that with very deep interest because the private sector wants to get in on it. The Chinese are heavily invested in this capability. The Japanese, in turn, are developing a whole bevy of capabilities that would allow for them to space mine. Israel is also getting in on the action, as is India's space agency. We have not created scalable mining colonies yet, but the investments are being made, and now the governmental interest is there as well as the private sector. So it's a question of when, not if. If you had to put a gun to my head and say, when do I think it's going to happen, I think within this decade you will have some form of rudimentary space mining going on.
All right. Hugh Godarin wants to know, do you know about Al Shepard and his billion-dollar spaceship balloon?
That in particular I'm not familiar with. That specific system I'm not. I am familiar, like I said, with Bigelow and his inflatable modules for the space station and what he wants to do with inflatable space hotels. Unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with that specific technology as I should be probably.
So inflatable space hotels, could you tell us a little bit about that? How big would that be?
Well, they would be very large. Bigelow has already tested the technology with specific modules attached to the International Space Station, and they're exactly what they sound like. They are basically habitats that are perfectly safe for human use, designed for prolonged human use, but they are inflated. So basically, it's a way to cut down on costs. They're light, which means, and they're portable, and they're easily moved, and that means that you have a reduction in fuel costs, and that makes it a profitable, potentially, endeavor. Bigelow Aerospace is leading the way in working out ways to build basically destinations for space tourists once they get into orbit. Rather than just kind of circling the Earth, they could potentially stop at one of Bigelow's proposed inflatable space hotels. And they could be very large. I mean, Bigelow into aerospace is envisioning large orbital complexes where people could rent these inflatable habitats for a period of time and live in space and be space tourists.
Oh, that'd be great to see space hotels, I suppose, on Airbnb one day.
It's coming. This is, by the way, Blue Origins, so Jeff Bezos' thing. So the key difference between Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos is that Elon Musk is very dedicated to Martian colonies. Jeff Bezos has from the beginning, what has attracted him is creating stations around Earth and in between the Earth and the Moon and the Lagrangian points, and ultimately around Mars. He is not as interested in colonizing the ground of these planets, of the Moon, of Mars. He's interested in creating habitats in orbit for people to visit. Think of the dystopian science fiction film Elysium, starring Matt Damon, in which the world's wealthy, the 1%, migrated to a space station, an Earth-like space station in orbit, and left all the poor people on Earth to toil in the muck. Something I think maybe like that is what Jeff Bezos was dreaming of.
Yeah, that's probably exactly what he's been dreaming of. Chuck Bam wants to know, have you heard of the Unknowledgeable Special Access Program, or USAP?
Well, I'm aware of UAPs. I'm not aware of USAPs.
Yeah, I would imagine that is short for Unknowledgeable Special Access Program.
Well, UAPs is short for Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess we'll just we'll move on from that question there. I see a whole bunch of you guys in here, over 80 of you now, and only 32 likes. So go ahead and hit that like button for me. It does help the algorithm. I'm looking for questions for you guys. Don't forget to drop in the Discord that Blue Chicken created for us. I am in there. I guess I'll have to pop in there after the show and see what's going on. So looking for questions. Well, I guess I'm not seeing any questions. Is there a way or a need, I suppose, then, for us to get back to the moon? I've heard of us setting up a base on the South Pole to where we'll actually weaponize the moon. What would you think of that?
I think that if we don't do it, the Chinese will. There are strategic applications to a lunar base. The Chinese and the Russians have officially agreed to exclusively, jointly, by the end of this decade, develop a sprawling, what they call lunar research outpost on the south pole of the moon. But in fact, it's a military outpost that also would be conducting mining operations for rare earth minerals and helium-3. And basically, think about it this way. The geosynchronous orbit is the furthest orbit away from the Earth. It's part of Earth's orbit, but it's the furthest orbit. Geo orbit is where we have a lot of sensitive satellite equipment. We have our nuclear command and control, NC3 functions. We have wideband global SATCOM, a lot of very sensitive military surveillance and command and control systems. They're very difficult to attack from Earth. But they're actually very close to the moon. And if you have a facility on the moon, on the lunar surface, you could conceivably have a clear line of sight to attack those very important, sensitive satellite systems in geosynchronous orbit. And this is something that actually the Chinese have gamed out. They have officially war-gamed out this possibility. In 2013, in fact, China did launch they didn't announce this, and legally under international law, every space launch, whether it's civilian or military, is supposed to be registered with the United Nations. And they never registered it. They launched an object into geo orbit. When they were asked about it, they said it was a scientific research mission. It was not. I believe it was a co-orbital satellite. But if China and or Russia, or even the United States, did build a permanent facility on the lunar surface, they would have clear line of sight to attack sensitive military systems in geosynchronous orbit around the Earth.
All right. Have you... Hugh wants to know, have you ever seen the rubber flexi doors on the China spaceships?
I've seen some of those pictures. They're very interesting, aren't they?
Yeah, they sure are. And Antonio wants to know, do you believe we have a solar warden program? And if so, for how long?
I'm not familiar with solar warden. I'm not familiar with that, no.
Okay. All right. Well, Brandon, I guess we're out of town, man. Look, everybody, the links that Brandon Weichert is about to give us are all in the description box below. Brandon, you want to tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at WeTheBrandon. You can go to my website. It's Weichert Report, WEICHERT report.com. And I'm a regular contributor to the Asia Times, the Washington Times, and Real Clear Politics. And I have been told in the next week I will be getting my inaugural piece published at National Review online, so you can start finding me probably there as well.
All right, and let me just ask you a quick question, I suppose, just for my own, I guess, knowing, I suppose. Do you think that there is a deep state?
Well, I will tell you, if you look up my writing at the American Spectator, at Real Clear Politics, at American Greatness, there is definitely an administrative state, and it is populated by lifelong bureaucrats who have a specific worldview that was definitely inimical to that of Donald Trump. And I do think there was a movement on the part of this organization to stunt and stymie the ability of the former president to run the country as he was elected to do. And I think that there is, I don't like the term deep state really because it implies a degree of conspiracy. I think you have a large group of people who have a similar worldview with a similar invested interest in the government operating a certain way and doing a certain thing that is not necessarily always in the best interest of the American voter. And I think that they make a lot of mistakes, and when they do, they cover it up.
Have you ever been told what to say or what you can't say on the radio shows or programs?
I have been I have been advised when I go to remember I'm an outside advisor. Mm-hmm. I am not a spook. I am an outside advisor. I know a lot of spooks though. But what happens is when I go to a base or when I go to a facility for the government, the person organizing it very often asks me not to bring up, like I said, my theory on the Wuhan lab leak. And when I do, I'm normally disinvited from that facility, as has happened before. Yeah. But I am an outside advisor. They bring in occasionally when they want sort of an alternative view on technology development, venture capital investment in China specifically. But I've never been explicitly said, don't say that. And if I were told that, now when I worked for the government, I worked for Congress, and I had to basically adhere to what my boss wanted to talk about. But I'm an independent contractor now, so I get to say and do whatever I want. I have been asked, though, please, we don't want you to talk about this. We want to know about this. But I've never been told, don't say this. It's never happened.
All right. Have you been to Redstone Arsenal?
I have not. I know a couple of the guys from there, and they've actually come to my briefings in Washington, D.C. In fact, one of the gentlemen is a colleague, but I've never actually been to the grounds, unfortunately.
All right, everybody. So Bernard Evans wants to know, what do you think is going on in Antarctica? And I guess we'll wrap up after that. How's that sound?
That sounds fine. I think that. In terms of Antarctica, I think as whatever we want to call it, global warming, natural changes in the Earth's environment, etc., There is definitely changes going on. We see it in the Arctic, where it's becoming more accessible. And in the Arctic, there's certainly a race between the United States and Russia, particularly for dominance there. And I think as that trend occurs in the southern pole, I think you're going to see a race for the natural resources between the great powers in Antarctica. Basically, right now, Antarctica has been able to be kept as sort of a sanctuary, a scientific research area, devoid of most conflict. I don't think it's going to stay that way for very long.
No, I don't either. You think? So, I mean, in all honesty, I mean, war is coming in there.
Put it this way, I was asked to go out to the Western Air Defense Sector 3 weeks ago, and the theme they wanted me to talk about is strategic surprise, basically a Pearl Harbor type event. What do? They're charged with defending 70% of the United States homeland. What do they do when they encounter, and they've been, what do they do when they encounter technology in their airspace that they necessarily can't defend against with conventional systems? And what would they be? And so my belief is that, and the Pentagon, I think, is leaning in this way, certainly the think tank community, both parties are, that yes, a great power war is coming. It possibly is already underway. And the question is, when will the real shooting start? And my next book is actually coming out next year, and it's all about Iran and the sort of the nuclear weapons program there. I think the next great war is coming, and I think it's going to be started in the Middle East by Iran. It's going to suck China and Russia and the United States in, and it's going to be a big one.
Well, I think the best way to counter Iran and Japan is just to, and even North Korea for that matter, if we have a problem with them, is, hey, let's give Japan nukes. Let's give Saudi Arabia nukes. If these guys want to...
The Japanese, until very recently, haven't wanted it. But this is certainly something, and I said the same about Taiwan. This is certainly something we need to do. It's a long time coming. I was very heartened to see that Japan, for the first time since World War II, is actually starting to sell its high-tech military equipment. I want to say to... it's another Southeast Asian nation. I can't remember now off the top of my head which one. It might be Myanmar. I don't remember though. It's one of the Southeast Asian nations, and it's history-defying because Japan has the peace constitution. After World War II, they vowed never to develop offensive capabilities or to sell high technology that could be used for weapons. But now Japan needs allies in the region as China's rise and as North Korea still continues to be a threat. And Japan's starting to finally offload some of their technology. They make some money, but in the process, capacity build, which creates allies, and they need that. And this is a good thing. And so, yes, I think ultimately they should have nuclear weapons capabilities. They should have ballistic missile defenses, however rudimentary, like the Iron Dome system that Israel has. And I think that the longer they delay, the weaker they are.
All right. And I guess let's just wrap it up right there. Thank you very much, Brandon.
Thank you for having me. You have a good night.
All right, hang on. Don't go anywhere just yet. Just hang on and let me finish this up, and I'll talk to you in just a second. So just want to let everybody know that Brandon Weichert's links are all in the description box below. If you're in the chat room, go ahead and leave a comment on the video. Make sure you like the video. It helps the algorithm. Remember, you can always find us online. Just go to www.conflictradio.net. We're available on iTunes and all of the normal podcast catchers. There's some neat new items in the store. Go check out. I finally figured out how to add some stuff there. It does help keep the show going and, replace equipment, things like that, all that was said. So just remember that Corn Pop was a bad dude, and you got to batten down the hatches and be safe.